Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Millard-Ball. I'm a professor of urban planning. I'm director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and it's great to see you all here tonight. And because on behalf of all my colleagues, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this joint UCLA Luskin Lecture and the Martin Wachs Distinguished Lecture, which is a collaboration between the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. Before we continue, I'd like to recognize that as a land-grant institution, we at UCLA acknowledge and honor the sacrifice of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, as they were the traditional land caretakers of Taronga, the land upon which our campus now stands. And tonight's presentation, like the Luskin School itself, is named for Maya and Renee Luskin, whose generosity and whose vision have made much of what we do in the school possible. And with their support, the school is able to bring together scholars in urban planning, public policy, social welfare, to offer master's and undergraduate degrees within one unified academic unit. And we're continuing to grow and expand. We have a new Master of Real Estate Development. Our first students are arriving in the fall, and a new professional certificate in data analytics for public affairs offered through UCLA Extension. But tonight is an honor to Professor Martin Wachs. And this lecture series, the Wachs Lecture, was created by his students on his retirement. And it's a series that rotates between here at UCLA and UC Berkeley, the two campuses where Marty taught. And he was one of my predecessors. He was the first director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And he really shaped it as one of the first research centers, not only to advance transportation research at UCLA, but also with a social scientific mindset that distinguishes it from many of our counterparts. And he remained a very active researcher, a close member of our community, until he passed away in April 2021. But let me turn to tonight. And I'm so happy to welcome Professor Robert Hampshire, who's Associate Professor of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And he'll talk about his work on roadway and aviation safety, supply chain resilience, and the future of uncrewed aerial systems. And I actually was first introduced to Robert, I think, by Donald Shoup, right? And I remember like sitting as a grad student on a bench outside Worcester Hall at Berkeley, talking with you and Donald. I think it was on freeconferencecall.com or something. That really dates us, right? We were talking about a potential evaluation of San Francisco's parking pricing experiment, SF Park. And so we ended up writing a bunch of stuff together with Rachel Weinberger on parking pricing and cruising for parking, and Robert taught me all about Erlang C and other like weird queuing theory distributions. But then Robert realized, like, why should I just write about parking when I can run all of transportation research for the federal government? So he went on to bigger and better things. He served in the Biden-Harris administration as Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology, and he was Chief Science Officer at the US Department of Transportation. And in that role, he really focused on innovation, so advancing technology, but harnessing technology to address transportation safety, these now dirty words like climate change and air pollution and equitable transportation for all. And so he's going to share some of that work with us tonight. And although she'll come up in a minute, I want to preemptively introduce Professor Ann Carlson, who will be moderating our discussion. So Professor Carlson is faculty director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and the Shirley Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law here at UCLA. And Professor Carlson also served in the Biden-Harris administration, where she was chief counsel and acting administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And she led efforts on everything from tightening fuel economy standards to requiring pedestrian automatic braking, emergency braking in new cars. So thank you both so much for joining us, and I'm going to give the floor over to Robert.
Well, good evening, everyone. First, I really want to thank Helen Wachs, who's here with us today, and Marty Wachs. It's a true honor to join you today for this year's Marty Wachs Distinguished Lecture. Thank you. What an honor. Also, Marty certainly was one of those first people in transportation that I knew of as a budding grad student when I was coming through that really did not just focus on roads and ridership, but values and ethics. And that's a legacy that is even more important today than ever. So thank you, and it's just an honor to be associated with that legacy. I want to, of course, thank Adam, your partnership and kind invitation to be here, your leadership at ITS. Thank you for that. But we've worked together for many years on things like parking, cruising, policy, environmental impacts of parking. You've been a great friend and collaborator, and thank you. And only other person I know who knew more about parking certainly was Don Shoup. And I want to acknowledge his passing. He's UCLA and University of Michigan. He was a faculty member at University of Michigan. And so I want to acknowledge UCLA and Michigan's own Don Shoup. He was someone who certainly inspired me. I was able to work with him, published a paper some years ago, and that passion for relentless passion and focus on parking, but more than that, it was about helping create thriving urban communities. And that sort of passion for a mission is really a part of a dovetail of what I really want to focus on today. And certainly I consider myself a Shoupista. And so it's an honor with Marty Wachs and also Don Shoup. So like Adam mentioned, over the last 4 years, I've had the honor to serve in the Biden-Harris administration under the leadership of Secretary Buttigieg. I led the Office of Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology and also the Chief Scientist for the department. The department hadn't had a chief scientist in 40 years. And so that was certainly a true honor. But really the best honor was serving with fellow appointees, leaders like Ann Carlson, but also the dedicated public servants. I have to say that I was just so honored to lead over 1,000 career public officials and servants in research and technology. It's an absolute travesty what's happening to federal employees, the expertise, the depth of commitment that we're losing. It's something I'll forever be grateful for, what they taught me about public service. And certainly for the students here and others, there's true honor in public service. It's my first stint in public service, but it's something that I will always cherish and something that is worthwhile, and I would do it. I'll do it again. But today I really want to just give a few remarks, and then we'll turn to Q&A, but I'll share some experiences and things I learned about particularly leading innovation at the federal level. And I had a little bit of time to kind of rethink and kind of formulate some thoughts about particularly now what it means to serve in the complexity of our times, challenges that we see to democracy, the polarization, but all this in the context of so much technological change. And what I want to do is kind of give a few examples of first-hand experiences of places where the role of research and technology really does play an important public role, particularly in furthering missions that are worthy. And certainly safety is one, but certainly equity, and certainly combating climate change. And I want to give a few examples of how to be more impactful, particularly us as researchers. I put my hat on as a professor. How can we be more impactful? And so from my experience over the last 4 years, interacting at various levels within Department of Transportation, White House, others, I really believe that researchers, technologists, within the transportation sector, we need to work diligently to increase what I call our social capital. That's our networks. That's not just who you know, but the trust, particularly when we're talking about new technologies. Trust is not there. We need to build that with different communities. What I call reciprocity and shared values, reaffirming things like safety is why we're here. And so I'll give a few examples about that, and particularly how we need to be more embedded into the transportation ecosystem and also non-transportation ecosystems. So we think about our friends in health, our friends in education, and others. How are we being embedded in building those that social capital with those communities? And so let me start with safety, as always. So when we joined in the depths of COVID in 2021, Ann knows better than many because NHTSA has the crash fatality data. Over 42,000 people, died that year in fatal car crashes. The rates went up. Right? The rates and pure number of fatal crashes went up during COVID. Each of those lives, I always say, is someone's mom, dad, sister, or brother. For me, it's personal. Every time I talk about safety, I say I must talk about my cousin, Nikisha Hampshire, who we were the same age, who died in a fatal car crash during COVID. And she was coming back from night school and veered into traffic at night. And so certainly these things are personal, and I think many of you have similar unfortunate stories. At USDOT at the time, we launched the National Roadway Safety Strategy, adopted a systems approach to safety, certainly, where 0 was really the only acceptable number for a number of people who die in crashes. We've seen, I don't know, maybe over 10 quarters of declines. I think we might have gotten under 40,000 just recently, and so there's some progress there, but society still seems to have this tolerance for roadway fatalities. Thank God that that's not the case in aviation. U.S. aviation's historically had a stellar track record. That's what makes the most recent fatal crashes so devastating over the Potomac and others. And so I just my heart certainly goes out to all those impacted in those crashes. People on the plane, the families, but also those who are working on the response. Because I know some of those folks who were probably working on the response, and they're dedicated public servants. And so what I want to do is talk about an example of how technology and aviation, sometimes that safety culture within aviation can interact with technology, and how we as researchers, technology can really make an impact. So in late 2021, around Christmas time in 2021, the FAA was prepared to ground every single airplane in this country just a few days before Christmas. And certainly in the room when they sent letters out, I was in the room like, we're going to ground every single airplane in the country, nation, because of concerns of a 5G telecommunications service that was thought to interfere with aircraft altimeters. An altimeter is a piece of avionics equipment that basically tells how high are you above the ground. It measures the altitude. And so how did we get here? For the previous 9 months before that, we had been working, the FAA, White House, industry, had been working feverishly to resolve the issue of a possible interference between this particular 5G service and aviation. And I led the technical response side of this on these negotiations. It was really intense. It was really important, but it wasn't just a clash between two industries. So you have telecom industry, you have the aviation industry. You had a clash of cultures. The aviation and telecom sectors really spoke different languages. The trust between the two industries was very, very low. And so what I claim, what was missing is really the social capital. to get things done. That's the norms, networks, institutions that really that were not in place that allow cooperation, particularly in times of crisis. And so, the aviation folks, would say, the technical folks and the aviation experts would say, oh, the 5G service was, they had models, and this is where the scientific part comes. There's these models and estimates that if the new service goes live, all the altimeters would produce inaccurate results or none at all. So it would basically turn off. Your pilot wouldn't know where they were high above the ground they were. The FAA follows these international standards that we're seen as very strict about what interference means. Now, okay, some would say that the FAA might be too strict. And also, by the way, the altimeters that were on airplanes were built to an older standard, so they're old equipment. So the telecom people say, well, they're overreacting. Whereas the telecom folks then also would predict, like, well, this 5G is not really going to interfere with these altimeters. But certainly on the other side, people would say, well, the telecom industry people did pay $80 billion to use that part of the spectrum. So maybe they're a little jaded or slanted a little bit. And so we were to adjudicate this. This was at this log jam. And there's certainly under Secretary Buttigieg's leadership, like incredible leadership, we were able to avoid grounding. You never heard of this in the newspaper. Well, they were newspaper articles, but we didn't ground all of the flights a few days before Christmas. And it really, we were able to negotiate a deal where the telecom industry would delayed their deployments of 5G until they can work more closely with the aviation industry to roll it out in an orderly manner. But, that's not really where it ended. The real work was that 6-month delay. Like, how can you bring these industries together? Technical experts, leadership, all the way up to the CEO level of these companies to make progress. And so during that time, the FAA led and certainly involved a series of convenings of the industry, that's aviation industry, telecom industry, locked them in the room. You must talk at all levels. We had daily meetings every single day with Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and FAA, every day at the engineering level. What models do you have? What's your prediction of what the interference will be like? How would this impact the public? Every day for almost 6 months. It was incredibly stressful for dedicated members of the FAA team. These are engineers. This is a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour day effort. And also, we conducted test flights. This is a nice thing, FAA, they have their own planes. So we could take airplanes, and this only happens through building that trust with the telecom industry. They turned on their antennas, and FAA flew certain flight paths to see really what was the interference. Really what was the ground truth. Because as you know, modeling, you mentioned queuing theory, like when you do modeling, you make a lot of assumptions, but you got to get the data. And we'll come back to getting data. And so through this series of activities that took an extraordinary amount of effort and actually heroic effort by colleagues and public servants at the FAA, incredibly stressful. Several folks actually had, the person had a heart attack, other stress-related illnesses. I mean, this is high stress. If you're talking about grounding every single airplane in the country. And it really is through this sort of joint effort in the trenches between aviation and telecom teams to build that trust and understanding, to understand the difference in norms about what safety means. It's really that effort together with Secretary Buttigieg's leadership that this 5G service has been rolled out throughout the whole country with no incident. These are one of those stories that you don't hear, but there's heroic efforts behind it. And I think that what I call the social capital and that working relationships that were built during this time are certainly going to serve the nation, as this issue is not quite over yet, but the fabric that we built is one that's going to last until the next incident. So That's one story where really building those connections and that social capital between industries makes a huge difference. Let me turn quickly to another example. And this one is about vehicle to everything, or V2X communication. So what is this? So just before the new year, this year, in November, the FCC adopted their final rules for auto safety spectrum, they call it, also known as V2X. And they stated that this rule will improve transportation safety by providing direct communications between vehicles and roadside units, other road users like cyclists and pedestrians. And that rule laid down the groundworks for using this spectrum. But it turns out this FCC rule was far from certain if you look back 4 years before that, when the previous administration's FCC rescinded, repurposed that spectrum that had been dedicated to auto safety. Further, the wireless industry, car makers, states, and this is a global issue, the global stakeholders thought that V2X was dead in the United States. Additionally, the US DOT chose not to continue rulemaking that would have made connected vehicle technology mandatory in new vehicles. And so when I joined, the team was certainly demoralized and disappointed in my team that the FCC had rescinded this spectrum. They had worked 30 years to make it work. And so much of the air was taken out of the room on this issue. But I didn't want to give up. So with much prodding and partnership, we convinced our fellow US DOT senior leaders and colleagues in industry, the White House and allies around Congress to advocate to reinstate or at least clarify the rules for using this spectrum. In particular, especially given that the NTSB for years had called for the deployment of V2X. And research showed that every day V2X was not deployed meant lives potentially lost. So from my perspective, what we needed was we can't wait for the perfect. We got to deploy now, not later. We're making sure that we couldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There was those who said we have to have it our way or no way around this vehicle V2X. But we said no, we've got to deploy today and not tomorrow. And so again, what did we do? We said, let's talk to our stakeholders. Certainly, the privacy advocates had long had legitimate concerns about privacy for the technology. We had other traditional transportation stakeholders who weren't fully convinced that this is really the right approach or even needed. Denmark doesn't have V2X deployed. They have really low fatality. So why do we need this? Also, the FCC needed a lot more technical data to show that people would actually use the spectrum. And so fast forward, what we did and we were able to do was deepen the relationship with these stakeholders. Some that were adversarial in many ways or weren't quite on board, be it privacy folks, be it some of the safety advocates. And by the way, car makers and regulators, there was no appetite for any mandates. So what do we do to move forward? And certainly, again, we hosted a series of stakeholder workshops, 3 of them having over 1,000 participants there, to work together to find a way forward with safety as the mission. Not whiz-bang technology, but safety. We developed a national V2X deployment plan, which takes a lot to do. But also, we were able to, at that point, put some money on the table. Money helps. But also do joint testing again. So this is at the technical level, the joint testing between stakeholders who have different points of view. I found to be very helpful because you can sit there and say, here's the data. Let's look at it together. Are we making the right assumptions? To be very powerful. So with that said, when the FCC reversed their course, it was far from decided in advance. Why did they do it? It wasn't necessarily because we built a stronger argument, but we did build a stronger network. a network of advocates that did go to the FCC or that supported or who didn't go to the FCC to try to kill it, right? That's also important. Like, brought them along. That rule was promulgated. And certainly VETA-X is far from, that story is far from being written, but again, those sets of partnerships and things we put in place will certainly serve the country in this cause as we move forward. Let me give you two more smaller ones, and then we'll get to the Q&A. But, so how can we think about increasing social capital between researchers and technology in different sectors? So how can communities and others, how can we do examples of us of doing that? Because I have two. One is from our SMART Grants program, and another one's called ARPA-I. So SMART Grants is a $100 million a year program that was created in the infrastructure bill that really was focused on tackling real-world challenges that communities have, transportation challenges that they have where technology can make the difference. This wasn't a technology for technology's sake program. It's identify needs, but it turns out that technology can help make the difference, particularly when it comes to emerging technologies or scaling up solutions that were proven between different communities. Also, the fact that this is not basic research, but it really is about deployment and real-world demonstration. And one of the key aspects of the SMART grants, we've made over 120 of them around the country since we were there. A key aspect is really creating this ecosystem of partners. We built the program not one winner, like the Smart Cities Challenge, you win all the money. No, we wanted teams to build an ecosystem of cities, places that can learn from each other. And that learning created a kind of connectivity between the partners, be it private sector, innovators, community, states, locals. And to help facilitate that, we actually had a new kind of application where cities can apply together on a joint, if they've identified a joint underlying challenge. So for example, one of them is called the Smart Curb Collaborative. Here's where I'm showing my parking routes. One of those is called the Smart Curb Collaborative that was actually led by the Open Mobility Foundation, which brought together 15 cities around the country to really identify and address curb management, parking, and reduce the congestion and environmental impacts related to parking and curb management. The OMF, Open Mobility Foundation, as an entity was really there to build that connective tissue, to allow certainly to build the learnings and capture common challenges. And so one thing that they identified across the cities of challenges was procurement. We know city procurement it can be quite the challenge. And so they actually created a new shared procurement approach that was able to pool across many cities. And that really helped a lot of cities get started faster, and maybe a lesson that other cities around the country could take advantage of. And so it's really that kind of collective problem solving, and entities like Open Mobility Foundation, there's many others that can really help accelerate the learning. And so I had the opportunity to announce at this past year's TRB the winners of phase 2 of the SMART grants. And it turns out that Minnesota and Seattle, from this curb management cluster, were able to secure a $15 million award to continue the work. And so that kind of learning and sharing with each other is one that, an approach that hopefully we can continue to replicate. And the last example that I want to point to is that we stood up an organization within DOT called ARPA-I, the Advanced Research Project Agency for Infrastructure, that really is aimed to tackle some of the largest and most outstanding transportation challenges that we have. ARPA-I is modeled after things like DARPA and ARPA-E. You might know DARPA invented the internet, and not Al Gore, but ARPA at UCLA. Leonard Kleinrock, who was a queuing theorist, it was one of the main people. But ARPA-I, we stood that up to really, again, change the paradigm of how we think about research and innovation in infrastructure and transportation. It really is about building an ecosystem of innovators, partnerships that to develop, that's between private sector, universities, and others, cities and others, to really come together to develop the technology systems that really help transform the nation's infrastructure. Through ARPA-I, particularly around, new methods of the way we work and the way that projects get done. So in my office as well, we ran the University Transportation Centers program, where we funded over 35 centers, and I know you all are great partners with USC on a UTC. Say that again, okay. University Transportation Center. But we know that those grants are really directed by the researchers on the ground at the universities. So ARPA is different than that. We say at the department, here's a challenge. Please go work on it. So it's much more focused in the sense that UTCs work on disparate and different topics individually. But an ARPA-I model is one where really it is like the sum of the parts add up to more than the individual contributions of the researchers. And that's what I want to sort of focus on, this idea that, how can we build structures in transportation, but I'll extract that to universities, such that the research efforts of us individually add up to more than the sum of the parts. I know we have institutes and centers, but if we think about it, are we tackling some of the most important challenges that this nation and the globe faces in a focused way? Is the work adding up to more than the sum of the parts? And I claim that we have work to do on that. I think particularly now with universities and the climate that we're in, need to demonstrate clear societal value in the impact that comes from our work. And I believe that individual efforts, while noble and important, aren't enough to show the impact we need right now at scale. Universities, we need new structures to make sure our work in a focused way is not being diffused in many directions, but leverages the collective knowledge of all of us. And this is something that I've been personally working on to try to build in a structure of how can a model like ARPA-I, it doesn't have to be ARPA-I, but something that's focused that the government does that can be embedded inside of a university, so that researchers and those at universities and their partners can work much more focused to see impact and get to societal value much, much faster. And that's sort of the call today. That's sort of a structure that what I claim would build innovation capital for the transportation sector and by extension universities. When I say innovation capital, what I mean is the social capital needed to do innovation. And that's building the relationships. That's not just who you know, but it's trust. It's the shared values and being reciprocal, showing up, listening to someone who has a different viewpoint than you, particularly stakeholders, that you need to get things done. How do you, and we've done that through hostings and convenings, but can you show up to someone else's convening? Can you take that person out to lunch who certainly is on the other side of the table of an issue that you have, and build a real relationship to understand that there's a shared way forward that is mission-driven and one that this nation can benefit from. And so that's my call for you individually, for your work to build your social capital, expand your networks, double down on trust, and at the university level, we certainly need to show societal impact. And I think we do that by making sure that all of our work adds up to more than the sum of the parts. And I know we can do it, and as we move forward, particularly around safety. So I look forward to working with many of you all on that. But first, Q&A. So thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. So first, it's just such a pleasure to be here. I love the Luskin School, but I also love Robert Hampshire. We got to work closely together. I was there for 3 years. He stuck it out till the very end. I think he left January 20th. So first, Robert, just thank you for the extraordinary service that you provided and leadership. So I'm going to be a bit of a downer. Sorry. But, we're just coming off of 4 years of really extraordinary work. I think the Department of Transportation really moved the needle forward in lots of different ways, and yet we are facing, as Robert's already acknowledged, incredible challenges. And we were talking before we came onto the stage about the number of people who have taken the so-called fork in the road. This is the second buyout, along with a huge number of senior leaders who are taking early retirement because their fear is that Congress is going to cut their pensions. And in fact, in the Senate and House budget resolutions, there are huge cuts anticipated to federal pensions. And so if they can get out beforehand with this voluntary retirement program, they can actually have some, decent retirement to rely on. And so I want to start with just your reflections on what that means for the Volpe Center, which is which is where a lot of the research is done for the Department of Transportation, along with other folks at DOT. What are these cuts doing, and what are their impacts going to be? You could talk specifically about some of the programs, but I do want to come back to aviation and so forth. But just generally, tell us what you're hearing, what you fear, and what kind of intellectual. When you talk about social capital, intellectual capital, it's being annihilated right now. So tell us about what you.
No, it's certainly being decimated, and what I'm fearful of, and I do see happening, is some safety critical and security critical personnel are being forced out in a way. Given the mechanisms that Ann mentioned, be it pension, be it others, but folks who are critical to our national security, particularly in aviation, there's safety folks, but there's also a national security component to some of that work at the FAA, that those folks are basically being shown the door. In my other parts of my responsibility, we were the lead for GPS, so global positioning system. So you may not know that the Department of Transportation is in charge of all non-military uses of GPS. That's transportation usage, but also agricultural uses, energy. Wall Street depends on GPS, particularly position and timing. And there's a set of experts who are deeply embedded that do work globally on this topic and coordinate with our allies that are being shown the door, or at least making the place not hospitable. And so that should ring all sorts of alarms, let alone just the human toll and how capable, how dedicated these folks are. And so there's a lot to be actually scared of.
Can you talk more specifically about the 5G issue and whether, so one of the things that you said is that one of the accomplishments of the department under Secretary Buttigieg and your leadership was to build these relationships that could weather the next crisis, or that could weather, a serious interruption with spectrum, or, uses that might conflict with one another. Does that last? What happens with the current administration, given that we're losing some of the talent in the department?
Yeah, so that's also impacted some folks who are the leads on the spectrum issues that are intimately connected to transportation are being sort of filtered out, I would say. Now, what we did build during this 5G altimeter issue with airplanes, we built a deeper relationship with the telecommunications industry on this particular safety issues. And it turned out those relationships in that time in the trenches actually translated to good value on V2X. So it turned out that on connected vehicles, the telecommunication companies have a way of doing that connectivity as well. And it actually turned out that the relationships, not just person to person, but institutionally now, that are there globally even, when you think about standards bodies, like that, I think that can last. But again, you have certain people who do shepherd global reputations and influence that are now being let go or leaving the department.
Let me shift to some topics that you didn't mention, but that I know you worked on. So talk about automated vehicles, what you think their future is, what role DOT plays. I'm happy to pitch in if we want to have a little back and forth on that, because NHTSA did have authority over the safety of automated vehicles on the road. But
yeah,
talk about.
I'll jump in.
We are in Los Angeles now, surrounded by Waymos all the time. They're everywhere. If you haven't taken one, I recommend it. It's really quite something to watch the technology. But what do you think the future is? Where are we going? Yeah. And what does the Trump administration mean for? Yeah,
I think it's one of those things. The future, what they say, is here now, but not evenly distributed. So we have the Waymos here and right in front of the hotel, and they're readily available. So they're here. It's here. I think Ann and you and NHTSA and the team did an incredible, masterful job, particularly around transparency, walking softly, making sure that things, break things and fix them later. That seems to be an MO of this administration: break things and then try to fix it. We were cautious and careful, but transparent in ways that, laying that foundation for evidence, the data, the SGO, Standard General Order, to really understand the characteristics of these vehicles, ADS and ADAS, different types of automation systems, and building that evidence base, I think was the right way to go. Certainly a lot of this depends on states and cities. I remember I was sitting in a meeting and I said, there's nothing at the federal level that precludes an automated vehicle on the road. Besides, if it's adhering to a vehicle, more than this, but more standards, then it can go. And states and locals have the jurisdiction. But I think there is a federal role, and I think you guys, NHTSA, and we did set things in motion that it looks like now are being, maybe it's not clear if there's been expanded. I saw something about doubling down or narrowing in some ways the safety data collection. On the face of it, it's not. That doesn't sound like that's a bad idea. To get less safety data is a bad idea. And so I think the approach and road we were on was a good one. It was slow. And I think the industry and others wanted more, and for the moment. And so the other side of this is when you think globally, competition, particularly with China and others. This is a race we can't, there's certain races that we can't lose globally. Certainly safety and security are one. This one, some could claim that technology and things that come out of automation, but also our vehicle sector is one that we can't lose globally. And so there's reasons to move this forward and from global competition, but also safety, if it turns out to be safer. And I'll turn it to you, because someone told me today, they said, one of the best things when I'm biking, the one thing I love is if there's a Waymo vehicle right behind me. Because I know it won't hit me, it won't door me, it won't try to pass me in some aggressive way. And there's something to that that we need to think carefully about and maybe harness. What do you think?
So one of the things that frustrated me in the narrative about automated vehicles repeatedly was the idea that safety and innovation were somehow incompatible with one another, particularly in the AV space, where the public remains deeply skeptical of automated vehicles, even as we see them around us much more frequently and as more of us are gaining experience with them, and as the data are showing, at least with respect to Waymo, that there may be safety advantages to automation. But if we don't monitor the safety and we don't have the data and we aren't transparent, public trust is going to disappear really, really rapidly, and then we can't innovate. So that was, I think, our sort of central motto at NHTSA was that safety and innovation are actually compatible with each other. They're actually key to one another. And I will say that there are a couple things that I would observe right now about the Department of Transportation and the relationship between the political appointees at DOT versus the political machinations that DOJ is engaged in. So one really promising thing is that they didn't actually completely annihilate what's called the Standing General Order, which is an order that requires very timely reporting of crashes involving either fully automated vehicles or level 2 vehicles. Those are Tesla, Autopilot, Ford's, Blue Cruise, et cetera. They did narrow it, and if anything, we probably need more, not less data, but Project 2025 actually recommended doing away with the Standing General Order altogether, and just a few days ago, there was a newly revised version that came out that maintains most of the safety data. I think if you're watching what they're really focused on, I think they want to really undermine state autonomy to regulate the rules of the road with respect to automated vehicles. They want a national program, and the national program is probably something like Texas, which has no regulation and basically lets any vehicle on the road, as opposed to California that requires a pretty extensive permitting system. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. But I think the political appointees at DOT are at least somewhat committed to the mission of the agency, and they have very little say in what's happening with all the fork in the road and all the folks who are leaving. They can't pick and choose who stays. They can't prioritize. For example, in the AV space, most of the most sophisticated employees are probationary because we expanded the hiring of technical folks to stand up a new office of automation safety. All those folks are gone. I think 23 out of 24 took the second fork in the road because they had all been fired in the probationary period and then were rehired based on the court order, and all assume they're going to be fired again, so they've all left. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but watching it play out over the next couple of years is going to be really telling. Okay, I'll ask you another question. So speaking of places for global leadership, you talked about the importance of the U.S. innovating in the automated vehicle space. And by the way, we are the global leaders there. I think it's pretty clear. I don't think China's anywhere close on AVs, but let's talk about climate. Yeah. Talk about what you did in your role as chief scientist on climate change, what you see happening as a result of the really hostility to all things climate, and what's resilient, what's going to last, and where should we worry?
Yeah, one of the first things, the first day of the administration, what we did is reinstated something called the Climate Change Center that the previous administration had just tried to delete, but we were able to undo. But more than undo, expand our climate change expertise, activity in the Office of Research and Technology. It's called the Climate Change Center. And so that office really, we brought on I thought really great people who, from places like Union of Concerned Scientists and others who are climate scientists, to really try to understand, particularly around infrastructure projects, what the really on the net life cycle would be on a lot of infrastructure projects. And that work really did make a difference in, be it project selection, be it the conversation about the types of projects that would be pursued and encouraged in the department. So I just tip my hat to the folks who were in the Climate Change Center. Great. Several of them they're gone.
Yeah, they're gone. A lot of them are gone.
A couple of them are gone. And so that's a big gap. But, what we also did was fund the largest number of climate-focused university transportation centers and supplemented those university transportation centers on additional climate-focused work. So UC Davis certainly is one of our UTCs, but also an additional center of excellence. They are particularly around modeling things like induced demand. I was talking to someone earlier about induced demand, and particularly for projects and trying to understand when you build a road, it's not just the traffic analysis on that road, but who now will be enticed now to use that facility, and how the methodologies and how to get that into policy practice. And so throughout the department, be it particularly within research, we really did ramp up and build on the expertise that was there, but we hired a lot of new folks. And I think the work is lasting, particularly in the UTCs, the projects that were already started in the community, be it infrastructure projects. That Center of Excellence is running on fumes, but I think the folks there at Davis are so terrific, but also the resilience component is one that, if you think about, and certainly you all are so incredibly affected here by natural disasters and wildfires, be it North Carolina, be it others. If you think about the infrastructure now that needs to be rebuilt, and the roads and bridges, and you think about the cost to rebuild after a disaster, the price tags are in tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. Now just imagine if we would have built infrastructure that was more resilient on the front end, right? Is there some cost benefit there that says it's worth building resilient infrastructure now, having the tools to know where are the most vulnerable pieces of infrastructure? And so we built those, our team at Volpe and others built tools that said these are the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable pieces of infrastructure, and ways to measure that. And so can we prioritize those segments, those bridges, those culverts, in ways that ultimately I think have a ROI, a return on investment, that's much higher than the billions of dollars to do emergency repairs.
So Robert, one of the things that is getting a lot of focus right now is the slowness in building infrastructure. And I think Democrats are taking some hits for, Ezra Klein, of course, has his book out right now. The high-speed rail in California is the poster child for, decades-long building projects that are way over budget and aren't even going to result in, the initial vision of high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco, at least anytime soon. Did you get a chance to think about how do you speed up building? What do we do about the interminable permitting process? All the kinds of delays that seem to be built into our ability to build, particularly given that so much money was granted to the Department of Transportation to invest in infrastructure around the country, and the payoff sometimes is slow to see.
Yeah, let's tag team this one because there's a lot here. Part of in the infrastructure bill, I think it announced 60,000 projects were announced, and you think about the scale and the scope, the capacity at the federal level, city, local levels, in industry, in the construction industry, and what that does to our workforce. Just the scale, first of all, I just want to anchor us on the scale is something that probably we hadn't seen in generations or if ever. And so just kind of start there. The velocity, the amount, the volume actually of the work was tremendous. And we have a lot to learn to get things done. So we announce, but actually get things implemented. I'll point to, we started something called the Project Delivery Center of Excellence. So this is really, how can we, go back to my social capital example, how can we weave together this web of practitioners that are doing infrastructure projects, and how can they learn from each other? How can they share data, best practices? And so this Center of Excellence we started throughout the department, certainly with Stephanie Pollock. I got to give credit to the folks who did that, led that work. Brought in experts to talk about how they did it. How can we learn from each other? And one of the first speakers we had was from the Netherlands. a professor there who wrote a book called How to Build Big Things. I think that's the name of it. And he had said something like, you got to plan slowly, but build fast. He had all these great principles, and this is all from a global inventory of both vertical and horizontal construction projects around the world, and how do they work. So you plan carefully. So there's no change orders. You can't get change orders, and you plan carefully, but when it comes time to build, you go like hell. You go, because things can change, inflation can go up, things happen. So you plan slow, build fast. And I think I bring that up because I think globally there's things to learn. There's certainly particulars here in the U.S., and I haven't finished the abundance book yet, but I'm sure there's lots of suggestions in there. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from others, and there's particular things here. I know, Ann, given your expertise and experience, I'm sure you probably have a perspective.
So most of what NHTSA did was regulatory as opposed to infrastructure. But we suffered the same problems of just process. And somebody once asked me, if you had a superpower as the head of NHTSA, what would it be? And I said, speed. I mean, everything is slow, and every process takes longer than it should. And I'm afraid that's going to be worse now. NHTSA may be losing 25% of its staff. We built the staff back up through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I think all of that is going to be lost. If you don't have the people, you can't get the work done. So that's one obvious lesson, but one thing that I worry about going forward. I think they're really complicated questions about environmental review that I think the Biden administration tried to address by streamlining some of the NEPA processes. California's doing some of the same with respect to CEQA and building housing. But I don't have any magic bullets. I am somewhat hopeful in the rebuilding of the Palisades in Altadena that there are proposals to allow architects to self-certify on permits so that we don't rely exclusively on our building department that is going to be completely overworked and stressed and not have the resources to get the building that we need to get done. But there's no magic bullet. I mean, I do think that actually being sensitive to it, which is something that I think Ezra Klein is trying to suggest, that maybe we have thought too much about process and too little about speed and efficiency and the ability to get things done quickly. There are some trade-offs, but maybe we've been making the trade-offs in the wrong direction. Yeah, and I put my technology hat on and think about things like AI and others. We started work, and I think it continues to really think about, if you analyze every single NEPA document, they're online. I mean, they're available. They're voluminous, library of documents. If you go through there and say, well, can you come up with any? And we launched a challenge actually to say, can you some technology or some approach to help, particularly on categorical exclusions, CEs that are like. To generate them quicker. So it's some generative NEPA document tool that could really help streamline. And so we did put some funding and challenges to researchers and technologists that can help develop a tool set, a suite of approach technology, particularly to help streamline the process. And I did see a headline that this administration is thinking about using technology in those ways. There's always pros and cons to that. But I think ways to help streamline the process could be helpful. So one of the things that I worry about so many things right now, but just to put aside the sort of crises of the moment and think about one of the structural issues that we seem to have been facing over the course of the last, at least since the Bush administration, is the whipsawing of public policy back and forth as presidential administrations change. Nowhere do we see it, I think, more dramatically at EPA, where the Bush administration issues one rule, the Obama administration comes in and issues a stronger rule. The Trump administration comes in and weakens it. The Biden administration comes in and strengthens it. The Trump administration now is going to come in and maybe not just weaken, but annihilate a number of these rules. And that strikes me as a structural problem as much as it is a political problem. And I wonder, in your role as chief scientist and as assistant secretary, whether you thought about how do we create durable institutions, particularly when you've got a Congress that won't act on some of the major problems that we face. I think environment is a great example, with the exception of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a huge exception and a super important one. The Clean Air Act hasn't really been amended since 1990. We've got these old statutes trying to deal with new problems. The Vehicle Safety Act hasn't been updated to think about automated technology. And it kind of creates this problem where executive agencies are doing, the policy making, and then it gets undermined as a different administration comes in. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that, if you have ideas about.
Wow.
I know it's a big question.
That's a big question. I don't have the answer. Certainly, one thing we always try to do is have a set of stakeholders, external from government, who are empowered to continue to advocate for certain positions. And now, on the regulatory side, maybe that's not by the force of law, but at least you're building out and supporting communities at the local level, and providing them mechanisms, tools to, I wouldn't say continue the fight, but to, have expertise on the issues that you care about. And so those things can kind of be a little bit more durable, like the people and the institutions at the state and local level is one approach that, I specifically in research that we tried to do to make sure that certain things could live on, because there's a set of stakeholders who really want to make sure it lives on. Like the Smart Grants program, we had 120 cities in place around the country that have these grants. The locals, the mayors in those places are on board. So there's at least some stakeholders. That doesn't get to the level and the depth that you're talking about. I don't know. You're the law professor. I don't know about federalism and how federalism really works. How much do we want to talk about states' rights? I mean, I hear, folks on states' rights, and I'm like, oh my. But we're somewhat on the other side of that, and I'm sure I'm using, inaccurate language in some ways, but should state autonomy, and what does that mean? And that's our nation. But of course, that's been weaponized in ways, unspeakable ways in this country and on certain topics. So, law professor, I think you might have a better take on this.
So I do think that two of the extraordinary accomplishments of the Biden-Harris administration were legislative. And that's the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I say that in part because throwing money at a problem might be more durable than regulating it. I don't know. I think it remains to be seen, especially in the climate space, where there's huge amount of money, both in grants and in tax incentives, some of which are threatened, but some of which I think are going to last, in part because it takes an act of Congress to overturn them as opposed to an executive agency. Same thing with the bipartisan infrastructure law, huge amount of money that went out that is going to build projects. And, again, some of it is going to get clawed back, but a lot of it is in red states. We're especially seeing that with respect to a lot of the climate money that is really, predominantly being spent in red states. So I think that's a lesson about, boy, when the leadership comes into office, one of the things that we really saw, I think, as political appointees is that we had 2 years where we really had to act, because those first 2 years, everything that happened was going to be, the thing that really lasted. And once we lost Congress, which happened, of course, and in the midterms, everything changes. So I think that's one lesson. I think I spent a lot of time thinking about the importance of regulation. I still think it's important, but the durability really might come from congressional change. Okay, so Robert, now I'm going to ask you some personal questions.
Okay, good.
So the first is, what does having been at the Department of Transportation for 4 years do to your academic thinking about who you are as a scholar, how your research is going to be influenced by what you've done, what book you're going to write out of your experience
That's great.
in Washington. Like,
No,
should put you on a couch instead of
No, thank you. Yeah. No, I really do think some of the things I talked about has resonated with me, particularly around making sure that universities and the research that we do adds up to more than the sum of the parts. And what kind of structures, what kind of incentives, organizations could be stood up to do that. Maybe that lives inside of individual universities or separately as some other, be it a nonprofit or some other entities to help foster that has been a change in my thinking. You know, it really is about building and leading institutions in an institutional context, and how to really help support my colleagues, help support the community in a way that it lifts it up to really have impact. I think that's the thinking where my mind is now, like, how can we continue to do that? Particularly when it's around like super important missions, like safety or like climate, but how can we do it in a more straight line way? And so that my thinking has been that, and how can I bring my students along with that?
That was my next question. What about teaching?
Mean,
how does your teaching change? Or do you know yet?
I don't know yet. I'm teaching a class in the fall, and all these things are going to be, abundance will be on the reading list for sure. But I've always loved working with students in different capacities. Teaching is probably one of my less favorite ways to work with students. We're on projects, on practical projects. I love working, and so maybe in that direction is where I'm leaning.
All right, everybody's curious about Pete Buttigieg. So, do you have a favorite Pete Buttigieg story from your experience at DOT?
Oh my gosh, this is great. I'll talk about something specific. Hopefully, this is not okay. I want to make sure.
Talking out of school.
But I remember one of these, very contentious, stressful conversations about this 5G and aviation meetings. We have very high-level meetings to make sure that, the airplanes in the country aren't grounded. Very intense meeting, and then it's over, and then you say, "Isn't that fun? Isn't this fun? Isn't this fun? This is great." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I've sweat through my shirt." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, like, what are we, like, how do I get involved?" And he's like, "Oh, isn't this fun? This is just great." So just like the passion and just the clear thinking, but also compassionate about the people, but also very just a clear thinker, that part. And it just kind of came through in that moment. Like, I was maybe a little bit crushed by the pressure of the moment, he's rising up. Like, isn't this fun? Do we think about all these different ways to work through this complex issue? And so that sticks with me. I'll turn it on to you. So what's your? Do you have a?
I have a few, but one of my favorites is when we were still working remotely, but the world was opening up a bit, and he came out here to tour the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and this was in the middle of the supply chain crisis, and I went out with him on a little boat tour. The first thing that was funny about it, which is not about him, but except about what a celebrity he is there were all these Los Angeles politicians on the boat, and they couldn't get close enough to him. It was like I was just watching all of them surrounding him, trying to get a piece of him. He was very gracious about it, but the people who were important to us in Los Angeles it was just funny to watch them. But at the back of the boat, there were reporters, and there was he did a TV interview, and I was just sitting there watching him, and then he got up and he was going over to do a radio interview, and in between, his digital comms person handed him a phone, and he took the phone and he talked into it for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and he handed it back to her, and maybe 2 or 3 hours later, on Instagram, there was an Instagram story of him describing supply chain economics in completely coherent terms that was incredibly politically astute, thinking about the labor implications, giving the Biden administration the credit that, as a politician, that he should be giving it as a cabinet secretary. And then, he literally had no notes. He just did this off the top of his head. And I said to the digital comms person, I said, it must be amazing to work with him. And she said, we never edit him. He just doesn't need it. He's just, everything comes out of his mouth in a perfect sentence. That is also, the political astuteness was, I think, one of the most interesting things to watch about it, because he's not just, he really is as brilliant as he seems when you watch him on TV. But he also, one other story is we had a really dicey issue that we were really trying to grapple with and didn't know how it was going to play, and the White House was super concerned about it. And the comms team had spent all this time with NHTSA leadership trying to figure out what happens if we could ask these questions, what are we going to do? And then we're briefing him, and he had better ideas in the first 5 minutes than anybody else who had been in the room. Knew how to spin it, knew exactly what the messaging should be, without having thought about it for more than sort of on the spot being briefed. So it is a pleasure to work with him because he's just so talented. He really is a singular talent. And maybe we'll see him running for president, I would guess. So I don't get to ask any more questions. We're at time, but we're going to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. So I think we're going to pass a microphone around. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and then the microphone will come to you. And if you could identify who you are and what your background is.
When you're part of government, I'll sit down now. Yeah. Industry has to listen to you. They don't have a choice. But I was thinking, if I wind up in a job where I'm not in government, what are some of the interpersonal skills or methods that you've learned or seen in action that I could employ to try and develop my own relationships with industry, wherever I'm working?
That's a great question.
Because like if I'm not in government, say, then they don't need to listen to me. So how might that dynamic work?
Thank you for that question. And I guess I've answered it like two levels. One, it really is like personally some attributes that I've seen for people who are really great at working with other people to get things done. But also, I'll say something as a professor, how I was able to do that when I wasn't in government. I guess one thing is, it really is at the personal level, like empathy, and learning, being open to learn is one thing that is a characteristic that's important, to be able to open to speaking to people with different opinions than you, and doing that, seeking that out. I've seen people who are very good at coalition building, really are curious about the people. So there's issues that you'll work on, but the people themselves. We had someone, our undersecretary named Carlos Monge, who was an amazing human being in ways that he would make sure that he, maybe there's someone on the other side of a negotiating table, but come to find out, he had coffee with them the day before. And they weren't really talking about the issue. They, as a human level, try to understand each other. I guess maybe that sort of translates nowadays in today's world and society, about everyone's so polarized in many ways. And so I think that skill of empathy and really listening and trying to find some common ground is one thing that I would say. And there's, dogmatic sort of positions can probably only take you so far, but it probably doesn't take you to an outcome. Probably takes you to more talking. And so that's just my own personal, perspective on a lot of those things. And so that's one thing. And then the other, outside of government, when I was a professor, I had a, say, NSF grant or other, I was leading a network of researchers, and not just researchers, but private sector people from foundations around, in this case, it was transportation equity. So we had, Adam showed up to a couple of the meetings, but convening people around a cause, and there is much more about soft power, not soft power, but, championing a cause that you can still do even if you're not in government, where people show up, but it's one where there's an issue worth tackling, and you can articulate that with colleagues and others to get them in the room.
Hi. I'm going to stay standing. My name's Jody Lidvack. First of all, thank you so much, and especially for honoring public service as someone that has always been my calling, so I get really sappy about it. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about not just the horrible stuff that is going on now, but what some people are starting to call Project 2029, which is when we have the opportunity to build upon whatever the ruins will be that are left. And a little bit of Ezra Klein, who said, stop focusing so much on the process and focus on the outcomes. What would you have, or you, do differently to achieve these outcomes, but maybe with different structures, different ways of doing things? Part one, and part two is, where are those conversations taking place? Because I'd love to be at the table.
That's great. Ann, do you want to? Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, so certainly some of my thinking, and I talked to other colleagues and about what's next, and say 2029, or even 26, and it's certainly not just 26. It's certainly not just reversing. It's not just like doing the opposite of what these folks are doing. It can't be that. It's acknowledging some underlying, I'll just pick on one thing, the underlying process issues, the underlying ways in which stakeholder voices are really brought to bear, maybe rationalizing in some ways of doing that in respectful ways. But say within research, I certainly think, again, the idea of having perhaps nonprofit other research entities that aren't in government that have a more prominent role, that can move faster maybe, or can take on work in a more sustainable way that lives beyond just one administration. So this idea that in the research community, not just in transportation, but writ large, what does it mean to have other structures both in and outside of universities that can really move fast towards societal outcomes? I think is one thing that I'd be excited to have that kind of conversation, particularly on the science and technology side, and bring you, I'll certainly add you into the signal group where these things are happening on purpose, I don't know, Ann, do you have the plan for Project 2029?
But
I don't even like that nomenclature.
Yeah.
We can't even use it, so I won't even use that
The
framing.
future. I mean, one thing we need to do is we need to restore trust in public service and public employees. I told people when I came back from NHTSA that the best kept secret about Washington, D.C. is the extraordinary talent in the federal government. And it's talent across a whole bunch of disciplines, from engineering to economics to communications to law. And I really fear what we have done to it, and we're going to need to figure out how do we assure people that we're not going to tear them down again. And I don't know. I don't have answers to that at this point. I'm hopeful that perhaps some of the court cases succeed in in the worst excesses, and that if the impoundment issues are resolved so that Congress actually has to take ownership of some of what's happening, that we will see something of a reversal, but we do have to rebuild. I don't think there's any other way around that. I guess the other thing to me, in addition to that, I do think that there's something to the kind of permit process versus outcome. But I also think there's deep issues with economic inequality, and we need to address them. I don't have great answers, but I think so much of the resentment can be traced back to the extraordinary wealth inequality. And we see it, we see it in housing, we see it in wages, and then we see it in, the excess wealth at the top of the income scale, much of which is being, the power is being exercised by those who have so much that they can't even begin to understand the problems of ordinary people. Not great answers, just issues that I think we're going to need to focus on and need to figure out how to address.
Hi, Dana Brofman. I'm an alumnus of UC Davis and UCLA. My question had to do with climate change. As climate change progresses, for example, carbon sequestration, I don't know if there's a consensus on how much time we have left before we get to a tipping point. Is that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And you were talking about losing all these people. All these institutions are going to have to overcome the low emotional morale and continue working on innovation so that when we get to 2029, we can adopt the new advanced technology that may not be adopted until then. So maybe you can address carbon sequestration, because we have to come up with faster ways of the sequestration to catch up, to keep pace with the climate change.
Yeah, I just saw some new work in carbon sequestration and some breakthroughs and some big awards in $50, $100 million range to continue that work. I do think that, like you mentioned, things that are in the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the tax credit, particularly around research and innovation on particular areas, that look like those are sticking. I'm not following day to day on that, but some of those incentives for the market to take on and help develop some of these climate adaptation and resilient technologies are still there. There's still some market incentives, but I think you're right. To kind of reinvigorate a new set of people to come into government to work on climate things in say 2029. I'm just thinking about, I love sales pitch to get people to join my team in the federal government, but I would really have to practice my pitch to say, come back again in 2029, get the band back together and beyond, and we're going to do it. That's a pitch that we're going to have to refine. I hadn't thought, that way.
So this is the one place where I'm a little bit optimistic, and I think we need some optimism and hope at the moment. No matter what Trump does, we're not going backward technologically. I mean, the advances in renewable energy in particular are global. They're not just domestic, and they are big domestically. The Inflation Reduction Act is accelerating them, and I hope it stays in place. But, we're seeing, huge shifts to renewable energy. We're also seeing, even with all the trouble in the electric vehicle sector, there are 115 new EV models on the market. They're fun to drive. The prices are coming down. The battery technology is not dominated by the United States, which is both sad and also a plus. The globe is not going to stop and wait for us, and we're going to see big technological advances because there's money to be made in it. It's not just in order to tackle the climate problem. There is global leadership to be had by being a green tech leader. So that doesn't mean that we might not hit a tipping point, or that but the projections already are that we are not on the worst case scenario anymore. People are no longer talking about 7 degrees Celsius increase. I think there's a lot of optimism that we can keep it. It's still way too high, still causing wildfires, et cetera. But that's the one place where I think even if we roll back regulations at the federal level, even if California can't implement all the policies that it needs EPA approval for, we're not going back. It's to borrow a Kamala Harris line. And we are moving in the right direction. We may go slower, But I do think that there's a lot of promise and optimism there. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, one more.
Hello, my name is Ceci. I'm a second-year student and the public affairs major, and I want to draw a little bit of reference to what you were talking about when you helped the air engineers and the telecom people communicate. It sounds like to me it was an example of you working at the margin of imperfect processes to make progress. And, when I was an intern at the White House, I think it was very important for us to identify ways to work at the margin of those imperfect circumstances. Yeah. And so I think a lot of us students are looking to work in a bureaucratic institution, in the future, whether that's public service or government. So I'm wondering what applicable advice you have for making progress at the margin of imperfect circumstances.
Oh, thank you. Great question, and thank you, too, for your time at the White House and your service to the country, so thank you. It's sort of what I mentioned, sort of appealing to shared values. At the end, if you can find, maybe it's Pollyannish, I don't think so, but if in this case safety is something that we can all rally around. Now the question is, how do we get there? And so that's one thing I would say. How do you do that? Maybe this is my pragmatic. Perfect can't be the enemy of the good. Do you want to be right in your position, or do you want to have great outcomes that you care about? And sometimes those aren't always the same thing. And certainly you got to fight and hold your ground when you need to. But if you can keep an eye towards those outcomes and values, then that can go a long way. So that's the lesson, and also what actually sealed the deal, though, honestly, was when FAA took the telecom people up in the plane.
The lesson is have a private plane.
Have a private plane, because when they said, okay, FAA, let's go test this. We have an airspace in Las Vegas and we have a plane ready to go. Meet us there. We're going to get on this small plane, take all your testing equipment. We're going to fly around and we're going to do this together. And you can see, touch and feel, You can see, and you're in an airplane, they're doing these measurements. I think after that moment, actually they're like, okay, we're in this together. And so, I don't know, can you do that? Can you replicate that? Maybe. And so, just really tactile experiences and seeing things up close can really help bring people together, maybe.
So please join me in thanking and applauding my friend, Robert Hampshire.
Okay, well, thanks to both of you. This was fascinating, and I love the message we ended on as well. Well, let me ask you your indulgence to stay here a couple more minutes. So first of all, I'd love to hand the floor over to Helen Wachs, who's graciously joined us tonight to honor Marty's legacy.
Thank you so much. I really just wanted to come and thank everyone at ITS who made this possible. I know what the spring quarter is like, and I know what the political situation in the country is like, and we are all very deeply appreciative of what you have done. Thank you very much. Now, they always asked Marty to say something at the end of the lectures, and he always quoted me. So I learned to behave and be very careful about what I said. And I don't have to be careful when I say he would have been thrilled to hear both of you speak today with what you said. Now, when I walked in and I met Robert, he gave a megawatt smile to me. And it's not because I'm that wonderful. It's because I'm Marty's wife, widow. And that's what Marty brought into any room that he worked in. He was short, and he was quiet, and he never dominated until he had to. But he respected people, and he had values, and he wanted the best for each and every person in the room. And I really wanted to speak to the students who didn't know Marty. Everyone here who knew Marty has that megawatt smile and that remembrance. Marty was a rock of integrity, and he wasn't, awful about it. I mean, you just knew. But he did write a book called Ethics and Planning, which has just been reissued. And, just, a couple of years ago. But he really understood what you were talking about drawing your lines and then communicating. And he had respect and he had values. And I'm thrilled that I was here for this lecture to see it in person. And for the students who are here, everyone in this room is absolutely brilliant. You know it, I don't have to tell you that. You all are. Marty was. All your faculty are. It's what you do with that intelligence. It's what you do with that commitment. It's what you do with those values that will allow you to make the changes that were articulated so beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. So if you enjoyed tonight, well, we have more events for you. Let me give you a quick preview. Our final Luskin Lecture this academic year is on May 20th. That's on LGBTQ plus equality and the 2025 landscape. And then at ITS, we have a few upcoming events in downtown LA on May 19th. We're going to discuss the long-term benefits of planning for mega events like the 2028 Olympics and Paralympics. We heard about abundance. Well, we have a symposium on that. So online on May 6th, where we'll think about how the abundance framework applies to transportation. On parking, Henry Grobar is joining us on May 29th, again virtually for a book talk. Our Arrowhead Symposium, we heard about new mobility. Well, we have more new mobility as well. That's October 19th to the 21st. And then finally, just to note, next year, ITS is turning 100, or we'll have 100 years of transportation research at UCLA. And so stay tuned for a lot of that. So once again, please join me in thanking Professor Ann Carlson and Robert Hampshire. This is fabulous. Thank you so much.